So let's talk through a few basic Warhammer 40k strategy tips that you guys should know. Perhaps a few of them slightly counterintuitive things that in the exact right situation can be big. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking about a few Warhammer 40k gameplay tricks, some of which might be a little bit counterintuitive, but many of them in the right situation could be a way of getting a nice advantage on the tabletop in one way or another. This one's a bit of a mixed bag, a few of them coming from a few interesting insights that people shared on a recent channel post, so thanks to all who shared their insights on that, and feel free to let me know any other basic tricks or tactics down in the comments below. I already have more than enough content to make a part 2 to this at some stage, but certainly happy to hear any other ideas to be incorporated. One fun one that got mentioned, that I've certainly managed to do myself once in the past as well, was to try and stop a charge by making sure that your model dies. It's only going to come up in a kind of niche situation, but once in a while it could be absolutely killer for an opponent to be lining up a charge on one of your units, and then all of a sudden have the unit destroyed and nothing to charge. Say for example you had these World Eaters 8 bound wanting to charge the Sister Seraphim model that was on an objective. Basically they'd be near 100% guarantees to kill her, then take the objective, maybe get into terrain so they're not as easy to shoot anymore, or maybe even be in a position where they could consolidate into your next unit and lock it up. For the most part in 40k you don't tend to have that much control as to whether your models live or die, but there are some ways that you could influence the chance of failure. If say the World Eaters player was a bit overzealous with a bit of shooting, perhaps took out the rest of her squad and then there was just her left, and she just had one more save to make, it might actually sometimes be a sensible gamble to try and re-roll that past save, which you could do with a command point re-roll if the difference is one of the enemy's scary melee units getting to an objective, getting safe or locking something up, or having them just completely sat out in the open ready for all of your massive counter-attack. For Sisters, they'd have the option of auto-failing a save with a miracle dice, or even in this situation, maybe overcharging her plasma pistol and then feeding in an automatic one so that she blows up. I remember playing back in 8th edition where I had a guard sergeant with a plasma pistol and they get free overwatch and deliberately overcharging the plasma gun to try and destroy the model and denying the enemy a key charge. Obviously it's kind of rare that you'd have too much chance to influence something like that, and the situation needs to be kind of right to make it really worth it, but it could swing a bunch of victory points, and it's just kind of interesting that just once in a while it might be firmly in your interest for your model to be destroyed early. Another minor thing that you can do to maximise board control of a unit is a bit of absolutely maximal spreading out. Often it might make a bit more sense for units to be a bit more bunched up and say trying to hide behind terrain and not get destroyed too easily. But when you do need to go for big screening or trying to stretch from point A to point B for whatever reason, even big units can chain out a surprising amount. If you've got a squad of 6 or less, you can basically just put each model 2 inches from the next one, and that's all nice and simple. But then the restrictions get a little bit more constrained if you've got 7 or more, when you need to have a model each within 2 inches of 2 other models within the same unit. If you really want to though, it does still mean that you can have the majority of the centre of the unit still be a line of single models if it makes sense. Say for example in this squad of 7 Space Marines, we've got the central line of the unit each being 2 inches apart, and then the ends just have 2 Marines on them rather than 1. Placing a little triangle so the ones at the end are still 2 inches away from both of their nearest peers. In theory you could do this with much bigger units if you wanted to. Say a big 20-man squad could basically cover the vast majority of the board that way. And occasionally that could be kind of big for slowing down a lot of enemy movement shenanigans and doing a great big move block of some sort. The only danger with this one, or spreading out maximally, is that you've got kind of limited options with removing casualties. I feel like a lot of the time in 40k it's actually less of an issue than you might expect, because if the enemy does damage to a unit they might well just do critical damage to it and wipe it out, or take it down to 6 models or less. But say for example, if this unit was a lot bigger than the Space Marine one, say a 20 model squad, and the central bit of it was all maximally spread out, if you lost any one model, then it would mean a lot of things aren't in coherency, so you basically have to remove models at the end of the turn until the unit was, potentially meaning that you wipe out quite a lot of the squad. It might be a little bit more of an in-theory risk than a practical risk though. I feel like often with unit coherency, if you don't have your upgrade models in the right places like sergeants or special weapons or things, you might just be at a bit more danger of having to pull those because of the point that they are in the unit. Spreading out like that could be pretty powerful for things like move blocking, or say reaching an objective while you still have other models in the unit able to deal damage to the enemy. But potentially every so often you could use it literally to hold more than one objective in the midfield. There's nothing to stop one unit from holding more than 1 point anymore. It's literally about the objective control points of the models on the objective. It's probably not going to be particularly relevant in the mid-game at all, given there's lots of enemy units around, and if one unit tries to do that, it's probably going to get absolutely dunked on. But it can be kind of relevant late game, when you might not have many units left, the opponent might not, so being able to hold 2 objectives with 1 squad could be kind of big. And even in certain missions, like the one where you have the split objectives, you might even have certain bigger base models that can actually tow on to 2 objectives in the midfield. Say like an Imperial Knight with a really big base might just be able to stretch within 3 inches of 2 objectives. Could just be something that's worth looking out for. I'd also not underestimate the amount of disruption that a spread out unit like that could cause in the early game if you can basically just set it up just in front of your opponent's army. You might be paying a bit of a premium for it with scouts or infiltrators, but maybe things like Tyranid Gargoyles, Chaos Nurglings, or even things like Space Marine Scouts could potentially pen an entire army in their deployment zone. And you could even cause big problems to things that can move through walls. Say things like Imperial Knights these days, they might not have the movement to fully clear and stay outside of 1 inches of your models, and doing something like this with chaff units in a big way against a more ground-bound or slow-moving army could be absolutely game-changing. Even if the opponent gradually goes on to win the damage game, they might just be too far behind in scoring. If you take the mid-board and have the run of the secondary objectives for a few turns, it might just be a lead that they can't come back from if you play smart. Next up, one option that I seem to find myself using quite a bit, though I've not really seen other players do so much, is using Desperate Escape just literally for positioning gain on the board. I feel like quite a lot of people just literally see Desperate Escape as something that you have to do when you're battle shocked or if you're surrounded, and the unit still absolutely needs to fall back. It's the one where if you have to fall back where you're battle shocked or you have to move over enemy models, you roll a dice for each miniature in the unit, and for each 1 or 2 that you roll, you lose a model. Occasionally though, it just might make absolute sense for your units to be able to fall back and just opt to do this anyway. Say for example, if you had a Knight Armiger here that was in combat with some Death Shroud Terminators, perhaps if it fell back from them in a more normal way, it would just have 2 weights on the left hand side of the unit rather than going towards that objective. Whereas if it uses Desperate Escape, it could just walk straight through them and be on that point to try and score it next turn. And then hopefully the rest of the army is moving up behind it and destroying the Death Shroud Terminators in its wake. Obviously this one would be playing pretty risky with an 150 point vehicle. You'd have a 1 in 3 chance of failing it the first time round, though you can command point reroll it, so essentially if you've got a CP spare, it's a manoeuvre that 1 in every 9 times is going to cost you 1 slain vehicle. Obviously not really something that you look to do unless the rewards are kind of great, but if it puts that Armiger in a great position, maybe trying to score an objective and hidden behind a ruin where it's just going to be a nightmare for your opponent to deal with it, it could be absolutely worth that small risk. Even if 1 in every 9 games it's going to bite you back hard. It perhaps could be a bit more reliable for infantry type units, maybe things like chaff infantry holding up something nasty. Losing a third of the squad could easily be a price that you're willing to pay to get them exactly where they need to be, as opposed to just standing out in the open ready to be destroyed next turn. Next up, maybe another rule that perhaps feels a little bit underutilised sometimes, is that pile-ins can make unexpected melee happen in 10th edition. I think that a fair few people are maybe just kind of intuitively playing it the way that it worked in 9th edition, which for the most part did give you a lot more control as to where your units move in close combat, but maybe in one important way, restrictions got a little bit more relaxed. When you declared a charge on a unit in 9th edition, the only unit that you could attack with the unit that declared the charge was anything that you declared the charge on. So say for example, these World Eaters 8 bound had declared a charge on the Hellblasters, and only them, they wouldn't be able to, say, attack the Gladiator, even if it later wound up in combat with them due to model positioning. 10th edition doesn't have that restriction though. It does mean that you can use pile-ins for potentially a couple of interesting melee shenanigans. The way that pile-in moves work is that you can opt to do it with each one of your models and they go towards the closest model to them, which might not necessarily be the actual unit that they're in combat with. On top of that, you can always make a pile-in move if your unit charged, even if it's no longer in melee at the time when it comes to activate. And again, that could be a kind of big deal as well. Say in this example, Angron and the 8 bound both charge the Hellblasters. Angron activates first and effortlessly kills them. The 8 bound could then still activate if they happen to be within 4 inches of the nearby Gladiator tank. Potentially they could just wander into melee with that and hit it very hard with chain axes and things. That means it could just be one way to get some more fight out of a unit if you're doing a big multi-charge, and there's at least some danger that one of your multi-charging things just destroys the squad that you're contacting. Potentially you could also just use it to engage other things with, say, the trailing end of a unit that wasn't able to make it into base to base with the thing that you charged. That one's sometimes possible, but sometimes won't be possible. In 10th edition, if you can get base to base with each model when you move it, then you have to, though sometimes it is still possible to block those models from being able to get into base to base. Say move the front ranks of your unit first, base all the enemies, and then the back ranks don't have anywhere to actually get into base to base with. That way in particular can be one way of countering fights first, which definitely is a bit situational but can be kind of big against the right targets, or even just using the trailing end of a unit to also opportunistically engage something else just to annoy and disrupt the enemy. Say in this example, the Terminators want to squash Death Leaper who has fights first. If they charge him directly, he's going to take a big chunk out of the unit before he gets to attack. But if things go well, they could maybe opt to just charge the Termagants, get a sort of middling roll for engaging them, only be able to get a couple of them into engagement range, and then the trailing end of the unit can use the pile-in move to attack Death Leaper, who by this point won't really matter that he's got fights first, as by the stage that he's engaged, the Terminators have already activated and have charged up their Power Fist ready to attack. I feel like this one's maybe a bit of a big brain play, and might occasionally work, but not always. Might be something to just consider a little bit opportunistically when you've seen what the result of a charge roll is, and whether or not you can game something like that. Another thing that you can mess around with pile-ins is potentially using Tank Shock and then doing your piling in after. Tank Shock is potentially a way to destroy an enemy unit in the charge phase if it doesn't have many wounds left. So say for example, if you had a single lonely cultist blocking your charge to an important unit that you wanted to get in close combat with, potentially you could do something like make the charge, use one command point for Tank Shock to hopefully destroy the model that's in your way, and then if you're within 4 inches of the next unit, you can then pile in and attack them happily. Could just be one last ditch effort to remove screens and still get into close combat with the thing that you want to, if your other ways of clearing the screening unit has fallen short. Moving on to a couple of overall mission strategy things from sort of rules finesse sort of things. One thing that can be kind of a big deal late game is pushing up with Firebase and command style units in a last ditch effort. Generally units that you mainly want to keep safe for the majority of the game, but then towards the end of the game, pretty much the only thing that matters is scoring points. So depending on the mission matchup and what the opponent's wanting to do, it might make sense to just throw them into the meat grinder in the middle of the board, contest primaries and be in places to do secondaries and all sorts of other good stuff. I'd say perhaps high value gun tanks or artillery pieces could actually be quite a good example for this. Say for things like Imperial Guard artillery, for the most part they want to be staying safe and firing indirect, though for the last few turns of the game they're at least fairly tough and fairly fast units. A turn or so's movement probably gives them a pretty good chance of reaching mid-board objectives, and even just kind of counterintuitively pushing up aggressively might allow you to deal a bit more damage to the things that really matter, perhaps a few enemy troops clinging to objectives and scoring them massive points. Perhaps the difficult decision with this is that you need to think about it early enough. If they are really hanging back and being artillery pieces staying safe, then a turn 5 movement probably isn't going to get them onto mid-board objectives to score, so you really need to think about if they're wanting to move turn 3 or turn 4, even if it might have the potential to reduce their firepower a little bit, or put them at a bit more risk than you'd really like. It's definitely a bit of a balancing decision. You need to decide whether or not just optimising their firepower and keeping them safe till the late game is the best thing, versus playing a little bit more risky. But in general, you certainly don't want to be in the position where you've just sat back and turtled a bit and destroyed the vast majority of the enemy's army, but basically all of your forces are still within their own deployment zone and the opponent's far outscored you all game because you've not moved up anything to make some last turn scoring. I feel like gun tanks may be particularly good examples of that, but maybe sort of command and buffing type units could be another, maybe things like, say, Lord Solar Leontus and his command block. They can provide some bodies to hold a mid-board point in the last turn perhaps, or maybe often as a favourite for Dark Angels players, having Azrael farm some command points for a good part of the game, and then having him and some intercessors emerge for maybe a turn 4 or 5 board skirmish to take the mid-board could be a way to get a bit of last value out of them. Finally, maybe it's not too uncommon to have certain units in the game just be a massive problem, maybe something that your army doesn't have a direct answer to, just due to them being enormously tough and enormously dangerous, that realistically your army might struggle to destroy in any reasonable amount of time. Perhaps examples could be things like Necron Catan a big Terminator Death Star that's got like 600 points worth of your opponent's value in it, or maybe a slightly bizarrely high investment super heavy like an Acaster's Knight. Depending on the mission in the game and what's happening with the unit, you might need to change your plans to just instead make sure that everything else gets destroyed on the board besides that one super unit, and just accept the fact that it's probably going to be going where it wants and destroying one thing per turn, and you just need to try and make it have the absolute least value that it can by trying to make sure those losses are acceptable in one way or another. All at the same time, hopefully you can be in control of the board wherever it isn't and focus all of your resources on destroying the rest of their army and scoring all the victory points. I feel like this perhaps particularly works well for big scary melee things. If you're repeatedly falling back from them, then they're realistically only getting 5 turns max worth of close combat and fighting, presuming that you'd be falling back from them at every opportunity. I feel like this one's actually not too hard to mitigate for certain slow-moving units, like maybe things like a Nightbringer Catan, or perhaps an Eldar Avatar of Cain. Ideally, just keep on feeding them chaff units that maybe they're killing like 50 or 60 points worth of models at a time. Even if they do that all game long, it's probably not been a win for them. Back away from them with important stuff so they can't catch it. Maybe if you do have a super annoying durable horde unit or something, you might be able to tar pit them for a few turns. That might be a bit less possible if they've got good sweep modes though. Or you could just keep on trotting up, say, high objective control units to the point that they're taking and make sure that they're not gaining victory points from it. If it's a slow moving unit, you could potentially just completely back off from them and stop them from being able to participate in the game too much if the opponent hasn't put them super central. If, say, you might have had like Typhus and a big block of Death Shroud Terminators deep strike into a corner. If you just drop back from them, they might not make melee for the entirety of the game, or at least for a good few turns. And again, hopefully in that time you can focus on running away with all the victory points and destroying the rest of the army. Admittedly, this one really isn't always possible. If the big scary super unit that the enemy has say a whole load of general purpose shooting that can be tearing the heart out of your army in a turn or two, or if it just moves super fast, like say Angron or Magnus, then it just might not be possible to keep them away from your important units, and you might just need to focus on bringing them down. Usually if it's possible in that situation, ideally you want to just swoop in and absolutely destroy them in one turn, bringing basically your entire army to bear on them, so you don't just leave them half killed and functional for another turn, though admittedly that's not always possible either. It really depends on the armies that both of you are playing and how cagey they're being with their great big Death Star threat. In any case, I'll leave that there for this one. Let me know your thoughts on the tips and tactics down in the comments below, and look forward to hearing any other basic things that you've done that felt a little bit smart, anything that's given you an advantage in a game. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming, with new ones out just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that links in the video description if you'd like to help support and keep the videos coming. Channel patrons do get a few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with the chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.